very happy to be with everyone to teach this course. So this will be an intensive 4-week session. So we'll be meeting every Wednesday night for the next 4 weeks. And I wish we could do more, but I'm going to be teaching a course this summer on the ethics of biotechnology here at Harvard. And I just don't have time, and I've got other things going on. But very happy to be here with you. And I think, if we use our time well, we can really build a very strong foundation, a really Thomistic foundation for some of these very relevant, very important, very difficult bioethical issues that I think are going to become increasingly relevant as we go forward here. So maybe we can just go around briefly as well. Maybe we can just kind of introduce themselves. And I'm curious to kind of hear, are there particular bioethical issues that you're interested in? I can make sure that we touch on those during the 4 weeks as well. I list a whole series of topics that we're going to touch on in some way or another, but maybe we can just go around very briefly, and you could just mention, is there a particular bioethical topic that's of real interest to you that you'd like to learn something more about? Eleanor, do you want to go first?
Sure. I'm interested in taking this class because I didn't get very much opportunity to learn bioethics or study bioethics. And so I was really interested in learning that because I did study Aquinas. So it's a new way of applying some knowledge that I already had. So I'm really looking forward to that. And I think if there's any topic that I'm interested in touching on, if possible, maybe some of the kind of questions of, I guess, how essence and Aquinas applies to like Down syndrome and situations like that, I think would be really interesting.
Yeah, very good, right? So we will touch on that. We will touch on anaphylactic infants as well, which is a really difficult particular topic. So I'm also the senior editor of Pediatric Ethoscope, which is the oldest pediatric ethics journal in the United States. And we're having a series of debates right now about a case commentary that was written by some pediatricians. And there's a tremendous debate right now in pediatric ethics about the moral status of anaphylactic infants. So these are children that are born in some extreme cases without a brain, right? In other cases, they may be just missing the cerebral cortex. And there's a group of people within the contemporary field that want to use anaphylactic infants as a kind of beachhead to begin talking about rationing care for other children with disabilities. Right? So this is a really important, really difficult conversation. I'm friends with a guy named Charlie Camosi from Fordham University. You may have heard of him. He's written several books, and I think he's doing a lot of good work. And one thing he's really focused on right now is defending the moral status and dignity of anaphylactic infants and disabled children especially, and resisting what Pope Francis has called a kind of throwaway culture. So we are going to touch on this even tonight. We are going to talk about just what is it to be a person, right? And the traditional Boethian Thomistic definition of a substance of a rational nature. And that will be, I think, very important for talking about the dignity and the moral status of children with disabilities. We'll talk some more about other, competing conceptions of personhood that might deny their personhood and their moral status and the significance of that, and how those consequences can be deadly. Okay, very good. Thank you, Eleanor. Maybe talk to Ryan next.
Yeah, I think in particular, just end of life issues in general do not resuscitate orders, and the morality of getting into that, I'd say. Also, I'd be interested in ectopic pregnancies a little bit, kind of the way of treating that, and what you think about methotrexate versus, simply removing the fallopian tube, something like that.
Okay.
But all of it's very interesting, and it sounds like it's going to be great. So thank you.
Oh yeah, thank you. Yeah, so DNRs are widely used. Some people actually get DNR tattooed on their chest. I've seen that. And there's a lot of conflict that comes up at the end of life. We're going to spend a whole class session on ethical issues at the end of life. I've served on clinical ethics committees, in Cincinnati and in Boston. And I would say this is a major source of conflict, is either when they resuscitate somebody who had a DNR, and then you initiate what's sometimes called the death machine, where once somebody ends up, in a PVS state, then you can't remove, artificial hydration nutrition from them, or there's a battle between the family and the medical team about whether or not care is futile or not. So that's a very common dilemma. So we will definitely touch on DNRs. Ectopic pregnancies are a very particular topic, very important. We will touch on vital conflicts as well, which I think are probably some of the most difficult issues, or maybe the most difficult issue in contemporary bioethics is, on the one hand, there seems to be a very important principle, which is to save the savable, right? On the other hand, there is also this very important principle, sometimes referred to as the Pauline principle, that you cannot do evil to bring about good, right? So I think, whether it's craniotomies or ectopic pregnancies are very important instances of that dilemma of vital conflicts and how we might deal with those vital conflicts. And there's a famous, or maybe infamous case that took place recently in Phoenix that some of you may be familiar with. There's a lot of debate about whether or not the Catholic bioethicists there and the clinical ethics team properly used the principle of double effect to justify what happened. In that particular case, there was a woman who was 11 weeks pregnant and had very, very high blood pressure. Her life really was in danger. She probably was going to die. And they had an emergency ethics consult, and there was a Catholic bioethicist named Teresa Lisotte from Loyola Chicago, who argued that they could, in fact, there's debate about how to really describe what happened, but my interpretation is that it was a very clear instance of a direct abortion, so that the child was killed as a means of saving the life of the mother, which is pretty clearly ruled out in Catholic teaching, Evangelium Vitae, and other documents. So we will talk about the principle of double effect later and about how to distinguishing direct and indirect action. So we'll circle back to that, Ryan. But thank you. Those are two really important topics. We'll talk about methotrexate as well. Let's talk to Mohammed next.
The pretense that there would be any ethics based on Darwinian natural selection,
okay.
The precedent for ethics.
Oh, I see. Okay. Yeah. So this is a good question, right? So, what kind of ethics can be derived from a particular interpretation of Darwin, right? So I would recommend Francis Fukuyama has a very powerful treatment of this in his book, Our Post-Human Future. If we had more time, we might read some more of that. So this is also sometimes tied in with what's called the so-called naturalistic fallacy, which is an argument that goes back to David Hume. David Hume has argued famously that you cannot derive an ought from an is, right? So you cannot move from some descriptive account of how something is to deriving some normative conclusion about how it ought to be, right? So some people have argued that there's actually two prongs to the naturalistic fallacy. And the second prong would be that even if you could derive an ought from it is, it would be brutal, it would be savage, it would be, we condone all sorts of terrible things, right? So let's say that you were, a really good Darwinian and you thought all that really mattered in life was reproductive success, right? Passing on as many of your genes as possible. Well, that might warrant all sorts of really horrific moral actions, right? You might say you have a moral right to kill all of your male rivals because that's going to increase your chances of reproductive success. You might say that justifies, sexual assaults, right? So tragically in the history of warfare, this is very, very common, right? You look at what happened in, say, Serbia or in Bosnia, when there were mass rapes and things like that. Obviously, that's very, very horrific morally, and yet you might say that's justified within a particularly Darwinian framework, at least an understanding of it. So, I think that is an important topic, right? This is something that people in sociobiology are going to run into here. If you interpret nature as being brutal and savage, as Wordsworth says, nature is red in tooth and claw, what kind of morality can you really derive from that? So this is going to be an important topic as well in the ethics of biotechnology, where people like Alan Buchanan and other major scholars, Julian Savulescu and others, have argued that we have a moral duty. There's a moral imperative to bring morality to bear upon nature, right, and upon the actual upon human nature itself, right, through genetic interventions, right, through biotechnology to radically transform that process, right? So why would we leave this up to chance? Why would we allow this blind, meaningless, savage process to stumble along when, through CRISPR and through other genetic interventions, we could really seize control of this process, right, and bring principles of distributive justice to bear. So we'll talk about that more in the fourth session. We'll talk about this project of bioenhancement, and we'll read an essay by Dr. Kass, especially called The Age of Genetic Technology Arrives. That's, I think, very, very powerful. How about Bill?
So you kind of touched on my main area of interest, which is technology. So I teach college students and technology.
Okay.
And ever since I read Ray Kurzweil, I'm interested to hear what my students' response to that would be. So I give them just a informal poll at the beginning of a class. How many of you would connect your phone to your brain permanently if you could? And I always get more than half of them say they would do that in a heartbeat. So yeah. I'm very interested in hearing about that.
Yeah, so I'm very interested in biotechnology. I'm teaching an entire class just on that theme this summer. I'm very interested in transhumanism. I think it goes very, very deep. If we had more time, we might read Michael Sandel's book, The Case Against Perfection. It's a very provocative title. I think we really need to kind of take a step back and think about, what is the purpose of this project, right? Where does this project originate, and what is really the ultimate goal of this project? I would argue it has its roots in figures like Francis Bacon and Rene Descartes and their radical transformation of just the purpose of philosophy itself, right? So Bacon's going to argue the purpose of philosophy is not knowledge, it's really its power, it's mastery, it's domination, it's control. Descartes will certainly go down this route as well, in the meditations and the sixth meditation as well. Talk about the purpose of philosophy is the relief of man's estate. It's the creation of an infinite number of artifices for the relief of man's estate. Right. So I think we're seeing this Baconian Cartesian project play out today in biotechnology. If you read Bacon, if you read The New Atlantis, if you read The New Organon, I mean, he's talking about creating immortal bodies. And he's talking about conquering death itself, eliminating death. Right. I just went to a debate here in Boston last year between William Hurlburt and Peter Thiel, debating about whether or not we should see death as a disease, right, as a preventable illness, right, that we could just keep staving off, right, so that we could achieve a kind of immortality. If we cannot achieve immortality, at the very least, we could be amortal. So that would mean that you would not die from old age. You could still die from, a gunshot or blunt force trauma or something like that, but we could just sort of indefinitely keep you alive. So we're going to read an essay by Dr. Kass called The Case for Mortality. It's a very profound essay. He wrote that article in 1983, very prophetic essay, where he argues that it's actually good that we die, that mortality is actually a gift and a blessing. And he goes very, very deep in that essay. So we'll read that in that fourth session together. And the other Kass essay, The Age of Genetic Technology Arrives as well. Again, very profound. He argues the best analogy for the modern biotechnological project is Greek tragedy. Right? He says that this is this heroic but ultimately doomed attempt to become like gods, right? What you remember, this is a very ancient story. If you think about what does the serpent promise Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden? You shall be like gods, right? I mean, I would argue this is really what's at stake, and this is what's driving the entire project of biotechnology. This is how Sandel frames it as well at the end of his book, The Case Against Perfection. The very first article ever written on biotechnology was by a professor at Caltech named Sinsheimer, James Sinsheimer. And he argued, right, he said that Copernicus and Darwin and Freud had displaced man from being the bright focal point of the universe. And this represented our chance to once again become the absolute center of the universe, right? To become the bright focal center point of the universe again, right? Fukuyama, the way that he frames it in his book, argued that the ultimate question raised by biotechnology is why not seize the power, right? Why not seize this godlike power, right? What's really at stake here, right? Why not seize control of the evolutionary process? Why not determine what we will become? Right, he's going to give a whole series of arguments as to why we should not do this. He's basically going to argue that we will lose our commitments, our most cherished and most fundamental commitments to dignity, rights, and equality. He's going to argue that all of those will be lost in a biotechnological era, right? Our most cherished social and political ideals. So we'll explore that more, especially in that fourth session. Is that helpful?
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, very good. Yeah, well, these are all very, very important themes that we'll keep in mind as we go forward. Let's see who's next. Is it Tom?
There we go. Hi. I guess when I came here, I really hadn't been giving much thought to the different issues, but now as everybody's talking about them, you got a lot of questions running through my head. And I guess one of the things that I've been thinking about a lot lately is probably has to do with how science and technology are affecting our food supply.
Okay.
Processed foods, things like that. And
yeah. Okay. Very good. Yeah, I was just reading an article about the IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces, just did a major epidemiological study about falling sperm counts. Right, we're seeing a collapse in sperm counts, and the best evidence we have seems to indicate that this has to do with our diet and the amount of plastic and pesticides and other food preservatives that we're ingesting, and this could really have catastrophic consequences going forward. Right, so. I'm friends with a guy at Harvard Law School named Glenn Cohen, and he's really convinced that all reproduction in the next generation is going to become artificial. Right? He really thinks that this is very likely, and there may be a real opportunity for counter witness here. If you don't really think that's the way to go, you could conceive and bear your children naturally, but he really thinks this is going to become increasingly common with designer children and artificial wombs and PGD, pre-implantation genetic diagnosis. Embryo factories are coming. Asexual reproduction is coming. We're going to see some pretty wild stuff coming here, right? And I have serious doubts about whether or not we're going to be able to slow or stop any of this. I think we're going to have to try to live with these things the best that we can and really preserve our humanity in the face of these technologies that are coming. But yeah, I think, if, let's say that, the IDF is right there and that there is a connection between our food sources and something like, a collapse in sperm rates, that would have, profound consequences for family life, for, sexual reproduction, all these various things, right? And it may really kind of force us down that path, which raises all sorts of other questions, right? About, is there something essentially dehumanizing here about some of these technologies? Can we really hold on to our humanity in a post-human era, right? Or in a kind of biotechnological age? Right? Fukuyama used the image of your soul dying, right? It takes that from Tom Wolfe. Tom Wolfe has this famous article. He said, "Sorry, but your soul just died." Right? I think he has there a kind of dehumanization. He has in mind a kind of dehumanization so great that you might, see death as preferable to continued existence, right? Okay, maybe we'll keep going here. Let's see who's next.
Yeah, euthanasia is probably the biggest one. It seems to be becoming kind of the default accepted opinion, which is, I think, kind of new historically. So. Oh,
absolutely. Yeah, if you look at the common law tradition, if you look at medical ethics going back, 2,500 years. Yeah, absolutely. So I'm very interested. I have an article coming out in Theoretical Medicine and Bioethics where I really take James Rachels to task. So James Rachels is a really famous bioethicist. He wrote an article called Active and Passive Euthanasia that was published in the New England Journal of Medicine back in the 1970s even. And it's the most cited article ever in the history of bioethics. It's been cited thousands of times. And Rachels denies that there's any meaningful moral distinction between active and passive euthanasia. He's a hardcore consequentialist. So for him, all that really matters are the consequences. He doesn't give any weight at all to intention. So it makes sense in a way. I mean, there is a kind of tortured logic there, but yeah, I'm very interested in the topic euthanasia as well. And, keep an eye out. I'm happy to share that article when it comes out.
So my main one is just the principle of double effect related to the vaccines and the aborted stem cell lines.
Okay.
And
okay.
And what I think what I know, I think the church is saying about it officially, and I'm still a little bit I still
okay.
want to hear what you have to say about it. So.
Okay, yeah, good. So the principle of double effect is very important, very complex. There's been tremendous debate about how best to interpret Aquinas's very condensed, his comments there almost are kind of as an aside, right? He's talking about justifiable homicide and he has this sort of very brief aside, and it's amazing how just a few sentences have given rise to really an entire academic industry. I mean, there's people that spend their entire lives just studying the principle of double effect. And there's been tremendous debate about how best to interpret the intending versus foreseeing distinction, that first condition of double effect. And that debate continues to rage to this day. I have another major paper I'm writing that's going to be published here soon, where I engage with Germain Grisset and Philippa Foot's interpretations of the principle of double effect. And I offer my own interpretation and defense of the principle. And it's very important in Catholic bioethics historically. And I would argue it's really indispensable in one issue after another. But it also does presuppose a number of other issues in action theory. It does presuppose, a very particular conception of intention as well. So many of those debates about double effect come down to technical debates about intention and about action theory and how to individuate actions. Is there a single action which is required for double effect, right? There'd be a single action with two effects. How do we individuate events as well? So we are going to talk about double effect later tonight as well. We'll look at Eberl's treatment of this. And, we're going to use this time and time again throughout these 4 sessions. With regard to the use of embryonic stem cell material that was taken to develop, you're talking about the COVID vaccines, is that what you have in mind?
Yeah,
Yeah. So that's actually very common in a number of industries in food testing, going back to an earlier point about food ethics. So we use, especially, there's a particular cell line, it's called HEK 293, I think it is. And to the best of our knowledge, this is embryonic material that was taken from a fetus that was aborted in, I think, 1971 in the Netherlands. And some embryonic material was taken from this fetus. And that particular cell line is proven to be very, very useful in drug research and medical and scientific research and food testing. And it's been used to develop a whole number of vaccines, not just the COVID vaccines as well. All right. So one thing that I would say is important here is that those cell lines, they're sometimes referred to as being immortal. I wouldn't say that's technically correct, but they will continue to divide indefinitely. So this is called the Hayflick limit. This is very important. So back in the 1950s, there was a guy named Leonard Hayflick, and he discovered that there's a limit to the number of times that a cell can divide. All right, that's going to be very important later on. We talk about radical life extension, but there's 3 types of cells for which that is not true. Right, so 3 types of cells. Anybody know that are not subject to the Hayflick limit? So embryonic stem cells, the first one. That's why everybody's so interested in embryonic stem cells, right? Second will be cancer cells, and the third will be viruses, right? So that's going to be, important, right? Because those cells will continue to divide indefinitely. I think there's less temptation that this would lead to further killing, right? So I think that is a legitimate concern that some people have, that if we're using embryonic stem cells that are taken from elective abortions, then that might tempt other people to, go out and kill and, to harvest or to use these stem cells, right? I think that's unlikely because the fact that those cell lines will continue to divide indefinitely. I think it is legitimate, though, to push for and to advocate for other cell lines that are not morally compromised, that don't come from a kind of poison well, so to speak, right? This is an important debate in research ethics. This goes back to debates about even like the Holocaust, for instance, like the Nazis. They were doing a lot of really, I would say, worthless experiments that don't really have any scientific value as well, but not all of them were completely worthless, right? So they were doing things like testing, how much, extreme cold can somebody be exposed to, or extreme heat, or, kind of something analogous to a kind of phase 1 clinical trial. And some of that is actually scientifically, valid, right? I mean, it's in the sense that it provides, it's a very, very limited use, right? And yet there's been this debate in research ethics about whether or not we should even use data or information that comes from, really morally questionable or really, in those cases, horrific experimentation. So we'll circle back. We'll spend a lot of time on double effect, especially. We'll kind of close class tonight talking about the principle of double effect. Okay, good. Let's talk to Kaylin next.
Yes, thank you. My background is in political science. So in addition to just kind of, wanting to get the general foundations of Thomistic bioethics, I'm curious about applications of Thomistic bioethics to, just ideas of self-defense and deterrence, especially. And also just curious about how to situate the applications of Thomistic principles relative to other, competing proposals in the public square, and how to best, package or present that.
Okay, yeah, very good. Thank you, Kaylin. Yeah, so, we just talked about Prince of Double Effect. There's tremendous debate about how to interpret Aquinas there. He does seem to make it clear, with regard to self-defense. The example he uses is self-defense, right? So someone's attacking you, there's an aggressor. Let's say they are an unjust material aggressor. He makes it pretty clear there that he's talking about private self-defense. He's not talking about a state actor. So he's not talking about a soldier. He's not talking about a police officer, and that is significant, right? So Aquinas does seem to clearly allow for direct intentional killing by a police officer or by a soldier because of the unique responsibility that they have for the common good, right? And these are, when you start talking the common good, you enter into some very deep waters here. He's basically going to argue that, the innocent by their very existence constitute the common good, right? And so protecting the innocent is going to be really paramount here. With regard to whether or not you can directly intend someone's death in a case of private self-defense, there's been tremendous debate about this. There's again Joseph Boyle, who is one of the founders of the New Natural Law Theory, along with Germain Grisset and John Finnis. He wrote a very influential article in 1980 that was published in the journal Ethics, where he makes the case that no, in that case, that he appeals to the intending versus foreseeing distinction there. And he argues there that your intent is simply to save your own life and to stop the attack, but your intent there is not to kill your aggressor. And that the death of the assailant is praeter intentionem. The Latin that Aquinas uses is praeter intentionem. There's been tremendous debate about how to interpret that. It can be translated as beyond intentionality or outside your intention, right? And whether or not the death of that assailant is foreseen or is it also intended. I think you have to start talking about, the actual physical causal structures that are at play there, right? I think it's implausible to say if you shoot somebody in the head that you do not intend their death, right? So this is a common critique of, especially it's called the New Natural Law Theory that I just mentioned. So they will have, I would say, a very narrow conception of intention. And this is important for them because Grisset wrote a really important article back in 1971 called Toward a Consistent Natural Law Ethics of Killing. And Grisset there came to the conclusion that dignity is an intrinsic property of persons and it can never be lost, right? So because of that, Grisset was very, very consistent. He started thinking through the implications of that, and it led him to be very strongly opposed to capital punishment. It led him to be very strongly opposed to killing in wartime. It led him to be opposed to, he advocated unilateral nuclear disarmament during the Cold War, right? Which was, some people thought was absolutely crazy, but, he was willing to defend that. So he's going to argue there that there's no, intentional killing is never licit. And that's going to be an important departure from the traditional approach, is going to argue that there can be no intentional killing of the innocent, right? So the New Natural Law people are going to remove that innocence condition and just argue that there can be no intentional killing whatsoever. And that's I think, a very significant departure, or some people might say it's a development of the traditional Western ethics of homicide, right? So they're going to have to say that for your action to be licit, you cannot intend the death of that assailant. It would have to be foreseen. Some people are critics of them. More traditional Thomists are going to argue that many of their claims are just implausible, right? The idea that you could fight a military conflict without intending the death of any enemy combatants, or, I've heard Christopher Tollefson say that you could remove somebody's heart without intending their death. So Grisset is arguing you shoot somebody in the head without intending their death as well, right? So that's going to be a kind of traditional Thomistic critique of the New Natural Law theories, that they're abusing the intending versus foreseeing distinction there. And they're calling the principle of double effect into question. And a lot of more secular people will seize on this to sort of ridicule the principle of double effect as well. So I have a colleague here at Harvard named Bob Truig, who is somebody I really admire and really respect. He's in charge of the NICU here, the pediatric intensive neonatal intensive care unit. And I'm just amazed by the amount of moral weight that he carries on a daily basis, what he has to deal with and the responsibility he has to bear. But he's very critical of the principal double effect, I think, because of some of the abuses that we have seen here. I think at times the principal double effect has been overextended. It's been abused. Elizabeth Anscombe warned about this back in the 1950s. Daniel Somasi's been talking about this a lot as well. Philippa Foot, I think was very concerned about this as well. So we'll talk about this more at the end of class as well, just how best to understand the principal double effect and how might it be abused or overextended or misused, and how might that actually really undermine Thomistic and Catholic bioethics. Talk to Lisa next.
I really hadn't thought about what was most pressing until I started hearing people talking. And I recently, one of my daughters just had an ectopic pregnancy and she's stationed in Japan. So it kind of hit us out of the blue, something I hadn't even contemplated, and all of the issues that go along with that. And then additionally, I've got, my children, I've got 6 of them in varying stages of having left the fold and strayed far. And so there's kinds of things, coming up with IVF, things like that. And then with my parents and even myself, because I'm not getting any younger, with regard to end of life issues. And, how do we go about dealing with those when you've got a family that's completely divided on many of these issues? So
yeah, well, it's very common, I have to say. Yeah, no, thank you. Those are all great points. Thank you, Lisa. And yeah, very common familial conflict. Very, very common. I've served on these ethics committees where at times we're trying to adjudicate, familial conflict that goes back decades or generations even, and there may be deep-seated disagreement about the right path forward, about whether or not to withhold care, to withdraw care, and that can be very, very difficult. I'll share as we go forward some of the more difficult cases I've been involved with, serving on clinical ethics committees, and it really has deeply informed how I think about these topics and how I teach them. About ectopic pregnancies, I would say that for those that do accept the principle of double effect, whether new natural law, whether traditional, Thomist, or even, secular people that do accept the principle of double effect, like Thomas Nagel or Philippa Foot, I would say there is pretty broad, deep consensus. There is a widely shared, considered judgment that a hysterectomy there would be a valid use of the principle of double effect. Right, that the intent there is to remove the woman's uterus, and not to kill the child. Right, that's a foreseen concomitant effect of the hysterectomy there, and that would be a valid use of the principle of double effect. There's going to be some other cases though where some people are going to say the principle is being strained to a kind of breaking point and it's being abused. But I would say there is pretty broad consensus there about ectopic pregnancy. And IVF you mentioned as well. I would say the key point there, is that there are fertility treatments that are morally illicit. The key there is that they are assisting the conjugal act to reaching its proper finality, but you're not replacing the conjugal act, right? And that's really the key point there. So there's all sorts of different fertility treatments that you can undergo. If a woman has a hormonal imbalance or has a vitamin deficiency or has a polyp that needs to be removed or something like that, those are all very valid fertility treatments, right? So there you're trying to assist the conjugal act, right, to be successful, right, to achieve its proper end, but you're not replacing the conjugal act, right? And as I mentioned earlier before, I think IVF is going to become increasingly common. I think, embryo factories are coming as well, where a woman will be able to produce thousands of embryos. And then, through PGD, through pre-implantation genetic diagnosis, you're going to be able to go through and to really genetically analyze them very quickly. And with just the moving your mouse a quarter inch, you're going to be able to select which embryo you genetically edit and then have implanted in your uterus or in an artificial womb. Uterus transplants are coming as well. I mean, that's just a matter of time. So these are all issues that we're going to have to deal with, right? I think it's very important we start thinking about them now. Okay, let's see. Who do we have next? James, do you want to go next?
So I guess it's about 3 years ago now. I read Well, I don't know if I'm going to pronounce his name right. Doyen Wen. He wrote an article that was published in the Thomist called "Why the Thomistic Defense of Brain Death is Not Thomistic," and that just got me interested in those issues. I'd never really thought about it very much before.
Okay, very good.
And so hearing more about that would be interesting to me.
Yeah,
but in specific, I guess I would say, I know that there's a sort of one of the more popular, I guess you would say, arguments out there right now that I don't know a lot about, and I was sort of late to the party with, and sort of sussing it out. There's been many variations on it now, sort of sussing it out has been difficult, but it's an argument where I guess you sort of suppose that there's a person in a hospital who's been sort of connected to another person, and as a consequence is keeping that other person alive.
Yeah, it's Judith Jarvis Thompson's famous article in defense of abortion, right? The violinist.
I don't know. I'm sure it has a name. I don't know what the original sort of start of it was.
Yeah, that sounds like Judith Jarvis Thompson wrote a really famous article back in 1973. It's one of the most well-known articles in bioethics. And she uses that image of a famous violinist being involved in an accident, waking up in the hospital, and they're hooked up to someone else who's very ill, and they're keeping them alive, and they have to do so for 9 months, and they have to lay there for 9 months and to keep this other person alive. So obviously the analogy here is with abortion. Interestingly, Thompson does not argue that there's a right to kill, right? She does not argue that she argues that the fetus is a person. That's very significant. It's a very significant concession that she makes there, that fetuses are human beings, they are persons, and that there's not a right to kill, but there is a right to extraction, right? To remove the fetus from one's body. Right. So I think that, if you look at a lot of philosophical literature, I think there's a real disconnect between your average, person on the street that's, pro-abortion, and then the kind of philosophical defenses that are being given by people like Michael Tooley, Marianne Warren, Judith Jarvis Thompson, Peter Singer. Singer and Tooley will go so far as to defend infanticide up to the age of 5 or so, because they'll argue that you don't become a person until somewhere between the ages of 3 and 5. Right, so they're going to argue there's a real radical disjunction between human beings and persons, and not every human being is a person. But Thompson will not say that. Thompson will say, no, fetuses are persons, and yet there's no duty to carry them to term, and there is a right to extract them from one's body, the same way the violinist would have a right to disconnect this ill person. She says if it were 9 minutes, you would have a moral duty to stay, right, to keep them alive. But for 9 months, she seemed to think that's just too long, right, or 9 years or whatever it is, right? So that's important. We are going to talk about artificial wombs as well. I'm cautiously optimistic about artificial wombs. There's a lot of really interesting research being done right now with gestating lamb fetuses, and they're getting better and better. I think this would transform the abortion debate in this country if this became widely available. It would be an inpatient procedure where the fetus would be transferred from a woman's uterus to the artificial womb. And that would really respond to Thompson's argument, right? Because Thompson's argument is there's no duty to gestate and carry the child to term. There you might say, okay, well, we're going to transfer the child to the artificial womb, and there's really no reason at all for the child to die. So I think that probably, I mentioned Glenn Cohen earlier. There's another woman named Louise King as well, who teaches reproductive ethics here at Harvard Medical School. They're both convinced that artificial wombs are going to radically transform the entire abortion conversation in this country in the next decade. So we'll see how that unfolds. I think they're initially going to be implemented to save children that are born very prematurely. Like that child in the Phoenix case at 11 weeks, right there. Viability keeps getting pushed back. I mean, viability now, I would say, is about 18 weeks, right? We keep pushing that back, right? I would say natural viability is about 38 weeks, right? That you can be, if you're born at 38 weeks, you can live without really radical medical interventions or aggressive medical interventions. With those interventions today, we've pushed viability back to about 18 weeks, and we keep pushing it back further and further and further, right? So, I think that's initially how artificial wombs would be deployed there as a last-ditch effort to save children who otherwise would die. And that would be a great good. I think the potential danger here with artificial wombs is that they become the norm and we lose the experience of motherhood, right? I think there is very real good there, very important good in the experience of, obviously, right now men can't get pregnant, biological men can't get pregnant. That may change as I indicated with uterine transplants, things like that. But right now at least, but I would say even that, as a husband and a father, that is a very transformative time as well. When my wife was pregnant, I think that was a really beautiful transformative time, even for me as a man, to see that. And obviously for her, that was very significant as well. For the mother, that's a very significant experience in their lives. And I think there would be a great deal lost if we were to lose that. Going back to brain death, that's another really important topic. That debate continues to rage even in Catholic circles. So even amongst people that really accept magisterial Catholic teaching, people are split right down the middle. Catholic bioethicists are split right down the middle. The church has not officially embraced one position rather than another. If you look even at the Pontifical Academy of Life, there's tremendous debate, right? Even amongst, Catholic bioethicists, even the new natural law people who tend to be pretty tight knit, they are divided amongst each other. Robert George rejects brain death. Their whole brain death or higher brain death. Melissa Michella, his student, is a very aggressive advocate for brain death. Jermaine Grisset and Patrick Lee have defended brain death as well, the neurocognitive criteria. So yeah, there's tremendous debate there. I would say that the strongest critics of brain death within Catholic circles would be Robert Spemann, the great Catholic German philosopher who's good friends of Pope Benedict. And then Alan Schumann, who's probably the most serious scientific critic of the idea of brain death. And Schumann will offer a lot of really interesting empirical evidence. Schumann will point to the fact that people that are classified as being brain dead, that meet clinical diagnostic criteria, they continue to grow. They continue to have functioning immune systems. If you cut them, the wound will heal. There's examples of women gestating fetuses for months. If you cut their hair, it will grow back. Their nails will grow. Can a corpse gestate a fetus? Can a corpse grow? Does a corpse have a functioning immune system? Probably not, right? So I would say it's examples like that give people a lot of pause about brain death. I think the more that we learn as well through the use of like BCIs and other, I'm friends with a guy here in Boston named Joe Giacino. He's done really important work in terms of developing clinical diagnostic criteria for whether or not somebody's in a PVS state, a persistent vegetative state or a permanent vegetative state, and then using deep brain stimulation to have, I think, some really significant effects where you're seeing, really significant beneficial therapeutic outcomes in people that are receiving these treatments who otherwise were kind of written off. And I think it's examples like that give some people very significant pause about brain death. I think another important aspect of that question is that people that are classified as being brain dead serve as organ donors. They serve as multi-organ donors, and we need those organs. And I think that is often in the background here, right? That people may be initially reticent to admit or acknowledge, but if you kind of push them, they will acknowledge that we really need those organs. And that's one reason why we should hold on to this notion. Bob Truig, who I mentioned earlier, he rejects brain death. He argues that these people are biologically alive, and yet this is a justified form of killing. And we are justified in killing them to harvest their organs because they're never going to get better, and that continued care is just futile, and that other people could benefit from receiving these organs. Obviously, there's a lot of debate about that, whether or not he's right about that. But Eberl's got a really good discussion of brain death that we will talk about. Eberl himself embraces what's called whole brain death. And we'll talk about that. And we'll talk about the traditional criterion of the cessation of cardiopulmonary function. That was the traditional criterion up until late 1960s, when artificial ventilators began to be used for the first time. I would say the field of bioethics was really created in many ways by that crisis, right? Through the introduction of these artificial heart transplants and through artificial ventilators. I think that the field of bioethics is really emerging out of some of those ethical crises that came about in the late 1960s, early 1970s. Is that helpful?
Yeah, thank you.
So, yeah, we'll definitely circle back to brain death and talk about that in great depth. Okay, good. Sean, do you want to go next?
I think the distinction between extraordinary means and ordinary means of preserving life is interesting to me, and when one of those can be taken away.
Yeah, very good, right? So there's been a lot written about this. I think there's more work to be done here. So this is a very old distinction that goes way back in Catholic bioethics. So the idea there is that the way that I understand it, is that, in the Catholic moral tradition and Catholic bioethics, there is this, fundamental principle, which is that you can never intentionally kill the innocent, right? And that's a bright red line. It doesn't matter how much, utility you create by, scapegoating someone or killing someone, or you can never intentionally kill an innocent person. And I think the idea here is that by withdrawing artificial hydration and nutrition, which are necessary for life, it's not plausible for you to say that you did not intend their death there, right? You can't really plausibly say thereby, withdrawing. So if you remove artificial hydration after about 3 days, after about 72 hours, your organs are going to start to shut down, your kidneys are going to shut down, and you're going to die. This is actually very, very common today in many hospitals. It's called comfort care. This is the way that a lot of people die. I've seen some very, very controversial uses of this, where they will sedate you so you're not conscious, and they will give you pain medication, and then they will withdraw artificial hydration. And but they won't put this on the death certificate. They won't put that you died from dehydration, right? They'll put that you died from leukemia, or you died from bone cancer, right? The Catholic argument is that you can never withdraw artificial hydration and nutrition, because that would be essentially murder, but you can forego extraordinary means, right? If they are deemed disproportionate, right? So let's say that you've got, stage 4 leukemia, and you've undergone 5, leukemia cycle, or you've gone through 5 chemotherapy treatments, and you could undergo a 6th cycle of chemo. It might keep you alive for another month, something like that, but you're going to be exhausted the entire time. You're going to be nauseous. You're going to be disoriented. A lot of people at that point are just going to say no, right? They're going to say it's just not worth it. The benefits are so small, and the side effects are so disproportionate that I'm going to choose to forego that 6th round of chemo there. I'm just going to die. I'm at peace. Even St. John Paul II at the end of his life, he had septicemia at the very end there. He was dying from blood poisoning, and he told them not to use any further aggressive medical interventions, not to give him antibiotics, and not to to allow him to die, because he was at peace. He was ready to go to the house of the Father, as he said. So I think that's probably the best way to understand that distinction. I would also say that, extraordinary means are used to restore someone to health, but ordinary means are also necessary for the basic preservation of life. So even if you're the healthiest person alive, let's say you're an Olympic athlete, you've got just perfect, cholesterol and blood pressure and BMI, you still need food and water, right? And but you don't need antibiotics there, right? You don't need a ventilator, right? That would be an example of medical intervention there, of extraordinary means, which are going to be optional. And then, obviously you're going to see conflict surrounding this as to when we should remove this or not. I'll tell you guys very briefly a very difficult, very troubling case that I was involved with here at the Boston Children's Hospital when I was on the clinical ethics committee. This was in the fall of 2017. We had a couple that was, very successful, very affluent. The wife was a very successful attorney. The husband was very successful in venture capital. They had put off having kids for a long time. They underwent IVF. Eventually, the mother became pregnant. She gave birth to twins. And maybe 2 weeks after birth, one of the twins had a minor seizure. And after that, there was some concern that he might have a very minor physical impairment because of this seizure. They thought that he may have limited use of, I think it was the left side of his face and his left arm. And the way the conversation went from there became pretty chilling. So this couple then went to their doctor, and they went to the hospital, and they began to very aggressively push for withdrawal of ordinary means of food and water from this child, and that this child should be allowed to die. Right? Because what the woman said in particular, I found really chilling, was she said that this child will not be able to survive in our world with this minor physical disability. All right, so we're going to talk about designer children later on. We're going to talk about genetic engineering. Some people ask me, who would choose a designer child, a designer child, who would be interested in this type of technology? I often think about that couple. I think they'd be very, very interested in the possibility of genetically engineering their children, having designer children. So, the way that this unfolded, so in Massachusetts, there is a legal precedent for withholding care, withdrawing care. And so that it's not withholding, it's actually withdrawing at that point. That is morally significant. And there was a battle that broke out at the Children's Hospital. There was a full-scale battle that broke out. And it really, I would say, split the hospital and the care team. There were a number of doctors and nurses that refused to be involved. They invoked conscientious objection clauses and said they would not be involved in any way. And a group of us attempted to sue to stop the withdrawal of artificial hydration. And eventually we were told that we did not have legal standing to do so. So we were not able to stop this from happening. So they did eventually withdraw the artificial hydration from that child, and he died about 3 days later. So that was a very, very difficult case. I found it very troubling as well that the doctor on record had studied philosophy in undergrad, and he had read Peter Singer, and he explicitly was appealing to the work of Peter Singer and preference utilitarianism, during this entire encounter. So, I tell my students this, when we study bioethics, these philosophical theories that we're studying have profound life and death consequences. People will live and die because of these theories and these distinctions. So it's so important that we get it right, because the stakes could not be higher. Any thoughts, any questions about that?
Quick question.
Sure.
So basically, is the distinction between ordinary and extraordinary means, is ordinary means basically just food and hydration? Or is there more to it than that?
Yeah, so some people have attempted to argue that oxygen should be considered ordinary means as well. Peter Singer has attempted a kind of reductio argument that he sees this as kind of reductio ad absurdum, that if Catholics are committed to holding that food and water are ordinary means, and oxygen should be considered ordinary means as well. I don't really see that as a serious objection. To put somebody on a ventilator, right, who's unable to breathe on their own, right? I mean, that's very clearly a kind of, it's a medical intervention there, right? So it's not, it's being hooked up to a ventilator is not necessary for ordinary life, right? I mean, that's going to be an extreme circumstance where you're unable to breathe on your own, right? So, but yeah, typically, traditionally, it's going to be just food and water, or considered ordinary means, which can never be withdrawn. So you can die from the underlying pathology, but you cannot die from either dehydration or from hunger. Good question.
Based on what you had just mentioned about looking at the basics of ethics, philosophy, and so on, I guess I've worked with a lot of these situations for many years as a chaplain, but my concerns now, I would say, are more in the area of defining personhood, yes, consciousness, because I think there will come a time, not in my life, but there will come a time, I believe, when there will be a huge conflict, because wealthy people will be creating basically a superhuman race. And then what happens to your normal Homo sapien trying to get into college and so forth. And then also, I'm concerned that at some point the government will use laws that will allow them to withdraw Medicaid, Medicare, and so forth if Catholic hospitals don't comply and provide everything they want them to. And I've seen, even in CHA conferences, for example, I've seen how willing they are to compromise on that, how willing they were when Obama came on the scene, for example, even on their face page, and they present themselves as representing Catholic hospitals, even though they really don't. That we're going to have to compromise that for the better of staying, in business.
Yeah, several good points there. So first of all, Susan, I just want to say thank you for serving as a chaplain. I've been really impressed by all the chaplains that I've met in my work. And I think chaplains do very, very important work, especially I would say in mediating conflict, consoling people. I've seen people just so overcome with grief that they're not able to make really important decisions that need to be made. And I've seen chaplains in those circumstances play a really important role. So thank you for all that you do. And the other point you made about the Gen Rich scenario, I think is a very valid one. I mean, I think if we look at genetic engineering and how this may unfold, I think that is a very plausible scenario that may unfold, where those who are very wealthy and socially and politically connected may go to great lengths to hold on to the advantages that come from genetic engineering, right? The kind of Gattaca scenario. Maybe some of you have seen that movie Gattaca, right? Where it's only going to be an advantage if only you have access to it, right? If it's widely and broadly distributed, then you lose that competitive advantage, right? So we had a kind of version of this here at Harvard. There's been various attempts to get rid of legacy admissions, right? So there's a tremendous advantage to getting into there's this arms race going on right now to get into these schools. And if you're the child of an alumnus, that's a very significant advantage. And so there's been attempts to get rid of that. And the people that have that advantage or have fought like hell to hold on to it, right? They don't want to let go of that. And I think we may see something very kind of similar with the kind of Gen Rich as well, where they go to great lengths to hold on to those advantages. If you can, boost your IQ up to genius level, if you're able to go up to 160, well, that's only an advantage if the norm is 120, right? If 160 is the norm, then you don't have that competitive advantage. So then you have to go up to 200, right? So yeah, that's going to be very interesting to see how this unfolds. I think we might see a kind of liberal eugenics emerge in the 21st century where, if you think about eugenics in the past, the first thing we think of are the Nazis, dragging people off, kicking and screaming to the hospital to be euthanized or sterilized or something. I think in the 21st century, we may see a very different form of eugenics where people are kicking down the doors of the research labs and the hospitals and demanding access to genetic engineering technology and saying, this is a fundamental human right. This is the fundamental human right to engineer ourselves, to engineer our children, and to decide, who and what we will become, right? So I think that the traditional arguments that focused on the coercive aspect, that focused on this as state-sponsored, as violent, as violating a person's autonomy, those arguments are not going to work against liberal eugenics. We're going to have to come up with other arguments as to why somebody should not engineer themselves or their children. And yeah, the point about the CHA as well, conscientious objection, very important as well. I think there's a lot of work to be done here on conscience and just what is conscience and developing a properly Thomistic account of conscience. This is something that I'm interested in. And why is conscience so important? And why should we honor a person's conscience as well? And there's a real battle going on right now in contemporary bioethics. There's a guy named Julian Savulescu who actually has the chair in moral philosophy at Oxford. And he's just a hardcore utilitarian. He's kind of a terrifying figure because he's just so cold and he's just so, his affect and everything as well. And he's just, aggregating all these numbers, right? He doesn't seem to have any kind of idea of what it is that he's aggregating or how he's doing this. And Savulescu keeps pushing this idea that Catholic or other objectors should be compelled to perform abortions or sterilizations or other things that they're really strongly opposed to. And he keeps trying to frame it as a duty not to provide that there's a failure to provide care and there's a duty to provide care. I would say, no, that's not at all the way to see it. It's actually, there's a refusal to harm one's patients. And that's the proper way to see that, right? That the fundamental telos of medicine, right, is always to heal and never to harm, right? And, so that's why people are going to say, I can't be involved in euthanizing my patients, or I can't be involved in sterilizing my patients because, right, the very first principle of medicine is to do no harm, right? It's non-maleficence. And I think that's the proper way to really frame that conversation. But that will be, I think, increasingly important as we go forward, because I think we are going to see tremendous efforts to compel people to violate their conscience. In my ethical leadership class, we were talking about St. Thomas More, I think is a very important figure. There's a wonderful book by Gerard Wegemer called Thomas More, A Portrait of Courage. If you have some free time, read that book. Very, very powerful. Okay, good. Let's go to Joseph. Do you want to go next? Good.
I was thinking, as you and a few people have said, there's a risk that what is life-saving for some can become boutique, for others. So I could imagine that with the stuff we've been talking about and various other transhuman technologies. For me personally, end of life issues have become relevant right now, not just life or death, but things like personal autonomy as regards, say, elder care or medical care in advanced years.
Yeah.
And just to steal from Ralph McInerney, I'm a peeping Thomist, so I found him very useful in teaching some natural theology. So I'm just exploring him where I can. So this is as a fascinating topic to view it from.
Wonderful. We're very happy to have you. And Ralph McInerney, he was a great man. He taught a lot of my teachers at TAC, and a wonderful person in many ways. And so end of life care, very important. We are going to touch on many of those themes. And what was the first point you mentioned was
the bioethics certificates, and then later personal autonomy, and elder care.
So very important, right? How do we define autonomy? So I would say the dominant theory in bioethics today is what's called principalism. It was developed by two scholars, a guy named Tom Beecham at Georgetown and Jim Childress at University of Virginia. And they wrote a textbook called The Principles of Biomedical Ethics, which has become, I would say, really the dominant approach. And a common critique of Beecham and Childress and principalism is that they tend to valorize autonomy and to kind of see autonomy as kind of a hyper principle. So they famously argue there's four principles that need to be balanced. There's autonomy, there's non-maleficence, there's beneficence, and there's justice. And they argue that all four of the principles are of equal value. And in any one situation, we have to, through something like Aristotelian practical wisdom, we have to discern which of the principles should be given precedence, right? So they're very influenced by a British philosopher named W.D. Ross as well, who was also a really important Aristotle scholar, did very important work in ethical theory as well. So Ross argued that there were 10 prima facie duties that hold for the most part. They're sort of conditional duties. So he's going to argue there's a conditional duty to tell the truth, but that can be overridden by other prima facie duties. So he also argues it was a prima facie duty to protect the innocent. So let's take, Kant's famous example of the inquiring murderer, somebody, that comes to your door and they knock on your door and they ask you, do you know where this guy is, right? Say that this person wants to murder them. Kant, I think, really, backs himself into a corner there. Kant's going to argue that you can never lie ever under any circumstances. Kant's, one of the great defenders of that kind of deontological approach. But, a lot of people are not going to find his approach to be very, very compelling. And so they're going to look to someone like Ross. And Ross is going to argue that, yes, in the vast majority of cases, you are going to tell the truth there, but that can be overridden by a more pressing, more stringent prima facie duty. In that case, it's going to be to protect the innocent. So in a similar way, Beecham and Childress are going to argue that, in some cases, autonomy is going to be given precedence. In other cases, it's going to be beneficence. Let's say, someone has a really serious psychiatric illness, or, they've got advanced dementia. There, we would not honor their autonomy. We would give precedence there to non-maleficence and beneficence, and we would make decisions on their behalf. But I think that's a really common critique of Beecham and Childress as sort of, baby boomers, as they really tend to kind of valorize autonomy and freedom and self-creation as being more important than anything else. And they're very sensitive about that critique. But okay, good. Maybe we'll keep going here.
I'm interested in learning how to articulate the proximity and how to measure the proximity with which one may participate in evil.
Okay.
So, some people would make the argument you never drink Starbucks coffee because, right, Starbucks contributes to Planned Parenthood. So every time you drink that Starbucks, you're killing a baby. It's probably an absurd argument. But then on the other side of it, you could say, I just bled out a 5-year-old in my backyard. And if you drink this blood of the 5-year-old, you might have, relief from your rheumatism. Okay. Well, clearly there's a problem. It's like you wouldn't say she's already dead, so I might as well cure my arthritis.
Right.
But then there's a lot in the middle, and I'm wondering, where is the line? Especially as it concerns the vaccines and the stem lines. So that's what I have no idea where to start there.
Yeah, so the traditional way to deal with this is the distinction between material and formal cooperation. And then there's justified and unjustified forms of material cooperation. So the key with formal cooperation is that you share the intent of the evildoer, of the person engaged in that morally illicit act. So if you're, the reason why you're receiving the vaccine is to show your support for abortion there, right? I think that's a pretty clear case of formal cooperation, but that's gonna be pretty rare that somebody's gonna receive the vaccine for that reason. You go to a particular hospital because they perform abortions there or something like that, right? So I think, maybe a good example of justified material cooperation would be, let's say you're a janitor at a hospital that performs sterilization, something like that, and your job is to clean the hospital, clean the operating room, where they do all sorts of procedures. That's not the only procedure they do there. If the reason why you're cleaning the room is because you support sterilizations, right, and you want those sterilizations to take place, that seems to be a pretty clear case of formal cooperation. But if your intent there is just to clean the operating room so that somebody can have a knee replacement surgery, right? I think that's going to be very.
So what about my grotesque example? Let's say you're totally opposed to the idea that this 5-year-old was murdered, but you want to cure your arthritis by drinking her blood and she's already dead. Wouldn't that just be too proximate to the evil to participate in illicitly, regardless of your intention? Or would it? Or does it depend on intention?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So this is a huge debate, right? So about how much weight should we give to temporal proximity? This has come up with the debate about the vaccines as well. The fact that this killing took place in 1971, some people said that's irrelevant. It could have happened yesterday. The fact that you're receiving the vaccine from the cell line, right, which was taken from kidney tissue, right, that was taken from this child that was killed. That does not involve any kind of morally compromised cooperation there. I'm not really sure how significant the temporal aspect is. The fact that this was, I think you also have to look at the action itself, right? So the first principle of double effect is the action itself must be good or at least morally neutral, right? So to give you an example of drinking blood, I think Aquinas is going to argue cannibalism is an intrinsic moral evil. It's never justifiable, right?
Transfusing blood, then.
Transfusing blood, well, that's different, yeah. So receiving a blood transfusion. So this is common. A lot of people receive organs from murder victims. This does happen, right? People are murdered, and let's say they are an organ donor, and they take their heart, they take their kidneys, right? They take their liver, and that is used to save.
So say the intention of the murderer was to provide a cure for my rheumatism. I'm opposed to the murder, but I just want my rheumatism cured.
Do you know about the murder? Are you aware of this? Are you?
Oh yeah, well, I know. Yep. Yeah.
Okay.
Of
course not.
He told me. The guy told me.
Yeah.
Yep.
No, of course not. Right. If you're just some person on a waiting list for a kidney, and you get a phone call, and you've got a 3-hour window to get to the hospital, and you show up and you undergo the kidney transplant. Later on, you find out the kidney came from somebody who was murdered. I would say that's
okay. So it's 1971. There was a murder that I know about, and now we can use this murder victim to prevent me from getting COVID-19. I guess I'm reminded of the psalm that says, "I will not take part in their bloody offerings; their name shall not even be on my lips." So that's like my gut, but I have no idea how to articulate that in terms of moral philosophy.
So these were cells that were derived from embryonic stem cells that were taken from their kidney, right? And then those cells continue to divide, right? So it's not really the cells that they possessed at the time of their death, right? These are new cells that have divided over the last 50 years. I would say the food that you're eating all the time, John, if you're eating cereal, if you're eating, these, the food, the medication, other medications you're taking have been tested using that cell line.
Right.
It's almost impossible to avoid. I think it's as difficult as wearing clothing that's not produced in a sweatshop. Right.
Yeah.
I would say every single article of clothing on our body was produced in a sweatshop.
Well, I just want to make a comment. I just joined you guys. It sounds interesting already, but I think that the way you distinguish the murder victim, I think that murder victim may have already, prior to dying, had agreed, like on your license, we can sign off and say, yeah, if I die, I donate my body to science, or I donate my organs. Versus the unborn child who doesn't have a say in the matter, right? There's no, the child doesn't say, you guys, I'll sacrifice my life for the greater good of medicine. So we're extinguishing that life without giving that child a choice when he's already on his way to being a full human, if he's given the chance to be born, versus the person who died as a result of an evil act, the murder. But still, they likely, it sounds like, if we dig further, they probably gave their consent if they died in some type of accident. They were willing to donate their body to science. So I think that's a big difference there.
Yeah, thank you, James. Very important point about informed consent. I would say it's a bedrock principle in contemporary bioethics, going back to the Holocaust, right? So all these people obviously in the Holocaust were experimented upon without their informed consent. If you look at the history of research ethics, there's even in the 1950s, 1960s, even at a place like here at Harvard, I mean, some of the stuff going on was just absolutely wild. And there has been a real kind of revolution, I would say, with the development of what are called IRB boards, institutional review boards. Maybe some of you have heard about IRB boards or interacted with them. I think the fact that we have IRB boards is really one of the great achievements of contemporary bioethics. I think it's extraordinary that these institutions exist. So their job is to oversee research and to ensure that informed consent has been given, that they have scientific experts as well to make sure that the research being done is truly efficacious and it's not, reduplicating other research, or there's not, waste going on. And make sure there's no coercion, make sure that there was no deception, and to really safeguard and protect research subjects. And the bedrock principle there is informed consent, right? So James, you make a really important point that children or people in PBS states, or, you could see somebody before they went into the PBS state could have had a living will, they could have notified other people that, they were willing to be an organ donor. But obviously a fetus can't do that, and a young child can't do that. So that's a larger debate that comes up in pediatric ethics, is the use of children in medical and scientific research, because children cannot give informed consent. And there's been a lot of debate about this. There was a famous debate back in the 1970s between Father Richard McCormick, who was a Jesuit, and Paul Ramsey, who was a really prominent Protestant theologian, bioethicist who taught at Princeton. And Ramsey came out very, very strongly against the use of children in medical and scientific research because they could not give informed consent. He saw that as inherently violating something like Kant's principle of humanity, that they were being instrumentalized and being seen as a mere means to an end. McCormick pushed back, and McCormick argued that we could impute to them consent, right? A kind of proxy consent, that if they were perfectly rational and perfectly virtuous, they would want to participate, and they would want to be involved in this research that would benefit others. This is especially controversial in what are called phase 1 clinical trials, where, does anybody know what goes on in a phase 1 clinical trial? So this is where we're testing the toxicity of a drug. We're testing how much of a drug somebody can take before you have really serious negative health consequences, right? So this is part of the drug approval process. In the FDA really is the gold standard here. And many of the people that participate in these phase 1 clinical trials tend to be people that, have substance abuse problems, they have mental health problems, they're homeless, they're financially struggling. In all my time, I've met one person who was very altruistic. I met a scientist here at Harvard who felt he had a moral duty to participate in these phase 1 clinical trials. He's the only one I've ever met. They tend to be people that are struggling in life, right? So there's been an ethical debate about this. So we're sort of preying upon the vulnerable, we're preying upon the weak, and yet that research is really important, right? In the drug approval process, we offer financial incentives as well. Some people have argued that's a kind of subtle form of coercion there. But there's a real debate about the use of children, especially. Why? Because there's no therapeutic benefit going to the person in that phase 1 clinical trial, right? And there's what's often called a therapeutic misperception, where people often make the mistake, they think that they're receiving medical care. They think they're receiving a therapeutic intervention when in fact they're just testing the toxicity of a drug, right? Usually they're, cancer drug, something like that. And so that's very, very common. And that's another major issue in research ethics. How do we deal with therapeutic misconception? But the issue there is whether or not parents are justified in allowing their children to be involved in these clinical trials when they are not receiving any benefit, but hopefully some future children will. So some people see this is really altruistic, this is really heroic. Other people say there's something really morally troubling here because the children cannot give their informed consent and they are being essentially instrumentalized here to benefit others in the future. Any thoughts, any questions about that?
I do have a related question to that, if I may. Isn't that another concern with the current COVID vaccines then, or at least one that was raised, that there hasn't been enough time to do all of the necessary testing before they rolled it out in a big way? And basically everyone who's receiving the vaccine at this point is participating in a very large clinical trial.
Yeah, so I mean, this is the fastest it's ever been done. Yeah, I mean, before this, it was 5 years, right? So yeah, this process was accelerated. There's been a lot of discussion about this. You know, a lot of people that I work with who, you know, are operating at a very high level seem pretty confident about this process. I think there are legitimate concerns that the people can't have about the process being, you know, sped up. You know, and I think that is a legitimate concern, right? You know, I did receive the vaccine. I mean, I felt peace about it. I have received the Pfizer vaccine. But I think that there is a legitimate concern there about that process being, you know, sped up, right, or being accelerated. And I know right now we have the emergency authorization. They are applying for the full authorization. They are going through that process. They are doing clinical trials. They're going through that 4-stage process. And I think everybody involved is aware of the seriousness and the gravity of this. You know, I've been very impressed by the people that I've met who work in this area and work in this space, and how professional they are. And that's given me, I would say, you know, a real level of peace about the process. But I do think it is legitimate to have concerns.
Can I just jump in real quickly before we move on from vaccines, just to say something really interesting?
Sure.
So Father Nicanor Austriaco, who wrote the book Biomedicine and Beatitude, he talked to the scientist who made the HEK 293 cell line in the Netherlands back in 1970 or whatever.
Right.
And he said he couldn't remember if it was from a miscarriage or from an aborted fetus. But the guy also said that it was illegal at the time to have an abortion.
Yeah.
So he thinks it's really unlikely that it could have been from an aborted fetus. So it's possible that all of this concern is completely pointless. It could be. Maybe there is a point to it, but even if there is, it's remote material passive cooperation. So
right.
So yeah,
Yeah.
I personally don't have a big problem with it. But.
Yeah, thank you, Ryan. So that's a really important point. I think Father Nicanor should maybe write an article about that, and if he's had a chance to interview that scientist. My understanding was that there was an elective abortion. Maybe that's not true. I think if it was a miscarriage, that is very significant morally. You know, there was not an intentional killing there. But yeah, I would agree with Ryan there that it's remote passive material cooperation. And you know, personally, I'm at peace with it. Maybe I'll reach out to Father Nicanor, Ryan, and ask him more about that. Thank you for that point.
I had a thought I wanted to mention, like, who decides these? I mean, we're talking right now, the countries you mentioned were Western countries. I thought about these issues, and I thought, like, in the East, we're dealing with people with different cultural values systems. For instance, in China, the powers that be in China, it's a communist government, and it's an atheistic government. So I could see them just doing whatever they feel like doing, not even considering bioethics. Yet, you know, what's our duty to our fellow man to try to intervene in something like that if we hear some crazy stuff going on? Because my concern was, like, what if they just people start to decide we got so good at you know, playing with stem cells, we can start combining animals and humans together and coming up with some centaur or something like that.
Well, that's already going on. Yeah, James, I hate to break it to you. That's already going on. So yeah, chimeras, transgenic species are being created right now. They're being used in medical and scientific research, you know, to study the development.
Well, that's an abomination. I mean, I'm coming from a Christian perspective, and to me, that's an abomination. And we're tampering with the natural order without knowing what the impact is going to be on the food chain supply if these things start growing and someone starts ingesting them, and then they have, and it affects. You know, this is like that's why Frankenstein is such a great story. because even a couple hundred years ago, people saw the implications of man tampering with things that we've never been involved with before.
Okay. Yeah, so there's a lot to be said here, right? So I think on the one hand, you're appealing to something what's sometimes called the precautionary principle. I think this is very important in genomics, in these debates about genetic engineering, is that the more we learn about the genome, the more we recognize just how complex it is, right? And so maybe the best analogy we have right now is an ecosystem. And what's true of an ecosystem is that every single part is interconnected, and we can't influence one part without influencing every other part. And there may be downstream effects that we can't really see for generations at a time because genes are recessive. And so some of these changes may not show up for a long time. And so, you mentioned China. There was this famous case just recently where there was a Chinese scientist who did genetically engineer these twins to give them a boosted immunity to HIV, right? Which sounds, people say, well, that's a therapeutic use of genetic engineering. Who wouldn't want, increased resistance to HIV? The concern, though, is that there's going to be other unintended consequences there that we can't really see. I think another good example here would be something like, sickle cell anemia is caused by a single wrong allele, right? Or, so let's say that you went in there to, genetically engineer that, that one wrong allele to eliminate sickle cell anemia. Well, that would be a great good, but it also would leave you more susceptible to malaria than at that point, right? So malaria obviously is a major issue in the global south, especially, right? And that could have catastrophic consequences. And so, it's not hard to imagine a scenario where you have very, very altruistic scientists, right? Someone like Jennifer Doudna, right? I think is truly altruistic and, really wants to use this technology to benefit people to eliminate terrible diseases like ALS or Huntington's or, one disease after another, right? The question is, can we have those therapeutic benefits without the dangers that may be inscribed within them? The image that Fukuyama uses is what he calls a devil's bargain, right? So what's a devil's bargain? A devil's bargain is one in which the harms are embedded within the benefits, and we can't have one without the other, right? He's going to argue that is really the case with all these different biotechnological enhancements, is that, yes, there are very legitimate goods here, and yet the harms seem to be embedded within the goods, and we can't have one without the other. And that, I think that's one reason why this debate about the ethics of biotechnology is so interesting and so fascinating and so difficult, is I think that very, very precise scenario that Fukuyama is laying out there. I think you're going to see that dynamic time and time again, where a biotechnological intervention solves one problem and yet it creates two more, right? I think you're going to see that dynamic time and time again.
Well, aren't we hearing about that right now with Fauci supposedly, the gain without function issue that I just started hearing about? He was aware of it, and they offshored it over to Wuhan supposedly, and then they lost control of it.
You're talking about the origins of the COVID.
Yeah, I mean, who's to say this won't happen next year or 5 years or 10 years? Because there's no way to control this. These guys are all this tampering. So I'm almost feeling like sooner or later something's going to happen, right?
Well, I think it is happening, right? So, I mean, if you read something like Yuval Noah Harari, right, he has a whole chapter called "Will Someone Hit the Brakes?" He's got a book called Homo Deus. It's a really very powerful, very chilling book. If you get a chance, check it out. He's got a chapter in there, "Will Somebody Hit the Brakes?" Right? And he's talking about all these different scenarios that may unfold in the 21st century. And a lot of people, when they hear this, they say, well, I hope that I'll be dead when this happens, right? But in that chapter, Harari basically says that we can't hit the brakes, that because no one really knows where the brakes are. And there is this sort of diffusion of agency that's taken place. And it's not really clear even who could hit the brakes at this point. And that the time for agency has passed. We've essentially opened Pandora's box. And the best we can really do now at this point is just sort of brace for impact. I think Dr. Kass is probably at that point now as well. I think he thinks that we can maybe in some way kind of try to render this entire process a bit more humane. We'll talk about that more in that fourth session. We're going to read a paper by Peter Augustine Lawler that is very hopeful. And I want to kind of end on a hopeful note. So we'll finish with that Lawler paper there. But we will talk about agency and about whether or not we've really lost control of this biotechnological project. One thing I find really fascinating here is that this project, which starts as this celebration of autonomy and self-creation and self-fashioning, right, very quickly spirals out of control, right? There's, Plato in Book 9 of the Republic talks about how extreme freedom leads to extreme slavery, right? That extreme forms of freedom have a tendency to undermine themselves. I think this might be another example of this, where I think the moment that some people begin to go down this path, I think the rest of us are probably going to be dragged along, right? The moment that some people begin to genetically enhance themselves, or one nation, let's say China and North Korea, begins to genetically enhance their citizens, I don't know if we're going to have much choice at that point, right? If your neighbors begin to genetically engineer their children, if your coworkers begin to genetically engineer themselves, if you're struggling to keep up in the workplace, if your children are struggling to keep up in school, do you really have much choice at that point?
Well, no, but also, I mean, the people you've mentioned, like, let's try to cure some of these diseases. Those are well-intentioned people. What about the people that are doing this out of malice? They want to hurt their enemy or their competitors.
Okay.
We're not even considering something like that.
So who's really interested in these technologies is DARPA. DARPA it's the research arm of the Pentagon, right? And they fund more of this research than anybody. Right. And the Chinese are heavily involved in this. I mean, the French, one nation after another. I mean, they're looking to the future of warfare. And I think we are going to see some pretty significant changes. I mean, right now, look what's going on. The Pentagon is testing out BCI devices where, pilots can fly an F-16 by sitting at an airbase, right? By just having their brain hooked up to a BCI device, and they can go fly an F-16, right? I mean, this is going to transform warfare. James, you've got your hand up.
Yeah. So the thing, I'm assuming is this a Catholic group right now, or is this a variety of backgrounds in our class?
I think
the Albertus Magnus Institute is open to anybody.
Okay. Well, I hear Albertus Magnus, I'm thinking, he's the great saint of the Catholic Church. And I try to tell people that's why we need a church, because we need a moral guidance in these new innovative technologies that Jesus couldn't talk about back 2,000 years ago, right? He couldn't talk about, hey, by the way, in the future we're going to have these technologies where we can manipulate genes, and that's why we need a church to guide everybody. So, I mean, really, that's like the purpose of the church as we go through time, as cultures go through time and change with the advancement of technology. We need that moral voice from the church, and I would hope it would be the ultimate authority, hoping that the Holy Spirit is guiding it. But again, we got other nations. I mean, only 1 billion, let's say, out of 7 billion people are even Catholic, I think, and a lot of those Catholics are nominal Catholics. So the majority of the world, this doesn't have our worldview. And so I think, again, I don't want to be pessimistic, but it's just a matter of time.
Well, I would say, James, you look at St. Thomas's Summa Contra Gentiles, right? So that's going to be directed towards people. He's writing to Muslim philosophers there. He's writing to Jewish philosophers there, and he recognizes that if you have a shared sacred text, right? If you agree on that the scripture is divinely revealed, then yes, you can use revealed premises and arguments. But obviously, a Muslim is not going to grant passages taken from scripture, and so you're going to have to use just reason. You can use rational arguments. You can use natural theology. You can use philosophical principles to engage with them. I think Aquinas is one of the best examples we have of that. So using philosophy to engage with people from differing backgrounds. And, I think, just looking at his account of natural law theory, we're going to talk about some of the metaphysical foundations of his natural law theory. That's going to be accessible to anybody, right? You're not using any revealed premises there that are not accessible to everyone. So in the rest of class, maybe we'll start to kind of transition into that. I want James to have a chance as well to talk. And then we'll start to maybe kind of transition into the Eberl reading. So I want to talk about the kind of metaphysical foundations of Aquinas's virtue ethics, his natural law theory, and how this grounds bioethics going forward. James, do you want to go ahead?
Yeah, I was hoping you. Are you suggesting that there might be some intrinsic evil to genetic therapies or something like that?
No, I would not say that. right? I would say that, therapeutic uses are certainly justifiable. I've never met anybody who's opposed to the therapeutic use of these technologies to cure a disease like ALS or Huntington's or sickle cell anemia. Or you could probably spend the rest of your life trying to find somebody who's opposed to the therapeutic use of them. You're probably never going to find them. I think that the question, though, is can we have the therapeutic uses without going in the direction of enhancement? I think that's a much more difficult question, right? Michael Sandel in his book, Case Against Perfection, is a series of case studies where technologies that appeared to be totally altruistic and totally therapeutic just immediately went in the direction of enhancement, just immediately, right? And I think we see this time and time again. So his book is going to end with this kind of question. He's going to say, what was driving the train all along, right? He's basically saying it was enhancement. Enhancement's been the goal all along. It wasn't therapy. We talk a big game about therapy, but the goal all along has really been enhancement.
And what would be and I'm sure it's a complicated argument, but what would be the problem with that? I mean, basically everything we do is for that. I mean, like fire is for that. And so what would be the issue?
Yeah, I would say one of the stronger arguments that I've seen is Fukuyama in his book, Our Post-Human Future. So he's basically going to argue that morality is rooted in human nature and a shared human nature. And if we lose human nature, then we lose morality. We lose the political regimes that depend upon human nature as currently constituted. So Fukuyama is going to argue that human nature as currently constituted serves as an important limiting principle upon what type of political regime is possible. So he's going to argue that all these various ideological attempts to kind of ram human nature, to ram the round peg into us, to kind of ram it into, the kind of, to fit the dreams of the kind of ideologue of the social engineer is doomed to fail because you keep running into this brick wall of human nature, right? So, whether that's Plato in Book 5 of the Republic, his attempt to eliminate the family and to practice complex marriage, whether that's, the Jacobins or the Bolsheviks or the Khmer Rouge, the Maoists attempting to, eliminate, marriage or the family, or, urging people to love everyone equally, to give, Marx had this whole idea about, you should love every single member of the human species equally. It seems like you're running up against some very, very strong evolutionary pressures there that are very deeply inscribed in human nature, right? So Fukuyama's ultimate argument there, though, is going to be that if we were to enter a post-human era, we would lose dignity, equality, and rights, which all depend upon human nature as currently constituted, and that we'd very likely see a kind of gradation within the species Homo sapiens. We would see the kind of gen-rich scenario emerge. And in that scenario, we would likely see the death of dignity, equality, and rights, which are the most cherished ideals we have in liberal democratic societies. So that's a very short, condensed version of what is a very complex argument. But if we had more time, we could read that book together, and I'm happy to talk about it further if you want to follow up maybe after class or at some other time.
Which book is that?
It's called Our Post-Human Future by Francis Fukuyama. Yeah, it's a powerful book. So the shadow of Nietzsche hangs over that book. I think Fukuyama is terrified. A lot of Nietzsche's predictions are coming true in the 21st century.
May I just respond to James's comment? I'm sorry. I'm so technological. I can't figure out how to raise my hand. I think what James referred to as far as cultural differences and differences in worldview is already having a tremendous impact on our healthcare system in reality. Like what I've seen this play out in real time. For example, I couldn't believe once when I was a hospice chaplain in a Jesuit medical center that they hired a person from an Eastern country where I would say maybe this is because they might have a different value on life than we do. But this was the director of the hospice program sitting there telling our team that he had the right to choose between a 90-year-old veteran wanting extended life care in the ICU compared to a 50-year-old woman sitting outside on the sidewalk who couldn't get care. And nobody wanted to be the first one to tell him that no 50-year-old woman is going to be sitting outside our door and not get care. But the point was, it was as if he felt as a doctor that he could play God and decide which one was a more valuable human being to keep alive. And where I saw this playing out in real time was in family conferences and patient meetings, where he might introduce himself in the team, he might introduce the initial medical issue, but inevitably he would toss the conversation to me because he had no idea how to converse with these patients as human beings.
Yeah, so I think what, the dynamic you're describing is very important. I think there is very real concern that we may, if euthanasia is legalized here, that all the various barriers that have been proposed would collapse. And I think if you look at what's going on in the Netherlands or in Belgium especially, I think there's very good reason to be concerned that they are moving very, very quickly in the direction of involuntary active euthanasia, and that all the various barriers have been in place. So, like in Washington or in Oregon right now, you have to demonstrate that you have a terminal illness, you have to demonstrate that you're not clinically depressed, you have to demonstrate you're not mentally ill. Obviously, children are not allowed to access this as well. My concern is that people would very quickly begin to make a due process claim and argue that their rights are being violated. They should also have access to euthanasia as well, even if they are not mentally, even if they are they don't meet those criteria. So I think that's a very plausible scenario that may unfold. And I'm very concerned about quality of life determinations being made. This comes up in debates about futility. Susan, I'm sure you're probably familiar with this with your work as a chaplain. There's a tremendous debate about futility. There's a distinction made between physiological futility and qualitative so physiological futility would involve, whether or not we can fulfill this bodily function. And the answer is almost always yes. Once we get somebody in the ICU, the answer is almost always yes. Can we restore respiration? The answer is almost always yes. Can we, take over one bodily function after another? The answer is almost always yes. So the only reason somebody really dies once we get them to the ICU is because we allow them to die, right? So we withdraw care. So somebody like Bob Trug is going to say that notion of physiological futility is essentially useless clinically because the answer is always yes. But he's going to be very concerned about that second kind of qualitative form of futility, where we are essentially playing God. So you sometimes hear that objection being made. Dr. Kass is basically going to argue that the heart of that objection is that no human being should have the power of life and death over another, right?
Yeah,
this person's life is not worth living, especially based on genetic or somatic criteria, that your life is not worth living. We're going to talk about procreative beneficence later on, and sort of sitting in judgment of some people and saying that their life is not worth living. So I think that is very important. I think there is a lot of pressure pushing us in that direction of making those qualitative determinations.
Yeah, one of my concerns is that I think people do have a good reason to be concerned, because so many decisions are driven by insurance company issues. And really, in so many ways, that determines how long you can stay alive.
So
and
what we're
how
saying
pressured the hospitals are to get you out one way or another. But also, I just see this whole issue as just a seed, just a little tiny seed being implanted in our worldview as a nation. And I see it already taking root, that we do not have the constitutional values that we assume we do. And down the line, this can impact everything.
Yeah, no, I think this is what Francis has been talking about, throwaway culture, right? I think this is a very valid concern, right? The loss of this bedrock principle, which is the profound, equal, and intrinsic dignity of every single human life. I would say it's an absolute core foundational principle of Catholic bioethics, right? And we may be in danger of losing that and seeing some lives as essentially worthless, right? So there was another point that I wanted to make there. It'll come to me. James, you got your hand up?
Yeah, I was thinking maybe the pressure can come. It seems like the people are saying there's too many people in the world, and that's kind of allowing this euthanasia argument to be listened to by many people. And I was thinking that based on the demographics, for instance, in China, they're saying that they don't have enough kids, or they're not having enough children now, that they think at the end of this century, they'll have, instead of 1.4 billion today, the population, for instance, in China is going to drop to about half, 773 million. And it's likewise going to happen throughout Western Europe. So I'm thinking possibly that could relieve some of the pressure to start euthanizing our humanity here. And so I wonder if you've heard any of that come up in your analysis.
I think that was a big theme back in the 1970s. There was all this hysteria about the population bomb. I've gone back and looked at some of the moral philosophers from that time. People like Honora O'Neill, people talking about Lifeboat Earth and things like that. People were defending, things that seem shocking today. They were defending involuntary active euthanasia. They were defending forced abortions, things like that. That seems to have died down some. But if you go back and look at that rhetoric at the time, I was really struck by the rhetoric that was used at that time. But I mean, going back to your point, I mean, John and I were talking about this earlier. I think to have a child is a profound act of hope. I think it's a kind of metaphysical act of hope to affirm the goodness of existence. And if you look at many places in the developed world, we're seeing collapsing birth rates. And I think there's a larger story to be told here. If you look at a place like Germany, the population is going to drop from 80 to 60 million in the next generation. And that's not through war or famine or disease or plague. The population did not even fall, that level during World War II when they fought a war of total annihilation with the Soviets, right? And so I think it's important for us to think about what's going on here and why are we seeing birth rates collapse in the developing world. In Norway, they're down to 0.8. 1.4 is considered catastrophic, right? If you fall below 1.4, you will never again hit the level that you were at. So they're down to 0.8 in Norway. So I think there's a deeper spiritual crisis here that has to be examined. I think Pope Benedict had a lot to say about this as well, but I don't want to get too far afield, but maybe the time we have left, let's just start with this question here that Eberl starts with in chapter 1 of his book. And the question is basically just, what are we? What kind of thing are we? According to St. Thomas, how would St. Thomas characterize us as human beings? What are we?
Rational animals.
Individual substance of a rational nature.
Okay, good. The classical Boethian definition here, right? Substance of a rational nature. Right? Let's try to unpack that because there's a lot there, right? So I would say this is the traditional definition. Eberl is going to say there's really 3 interrelated theses here, right? He's going to, Eberl is going to defend the traditional account that every human being is a person, that personhood is an intrinsic property of human beings. There are not any human beings who are not persons. That's a major difference with a lot of contemporary bioethists who will argue, and people like Peter Singer, Michael Tooley, Marianne Warren will argue that there are some human beings who are not persons, and they will appeal especially to, I would say, a kind of Platonic, Cartesian, Lockean account of personhood, where what we are essentially are either spirits or ghosts or souls, right, that somehow inhabit or possess or occupy or invade a living biological organism, right? And I'm continually amazed by this, how prevalent this is, this sort of Gnostic, Cartesian, Platonic conception of what we are. I just went back, I watched the movie Being John Malkovich not too long ago. I think it's sort of dealing with this on some levels. Aquinas very strongly comes out against this view, right? Aquinas is going to say this is a deeply flawed view of what it is to be a human being, right? He's going to say we are a substance, right, composed of an immaterial soul, which informs a material body, right? Secondly, he's going to say human person is not identical to our souls. We're not identical to that immaterial spiritual substance, right? At one point, Aquinas is going to say, I think it's in his commentary in Colossians, where he says, I am not my soul, right? You might say, I'm not merely my soul, right? Soul is one of the constituent principles that makes up who I am, right? But I am not merely my soul, nor am I merely my body, right? So yes, and we are. It says animality is an essential attribute. It is a fundamental attribute of human nature, right? So I think what, this account here, I think is so important to everything we're going to do going forward, right? That we are, right, this composite, right, holomorphic unity of a soul, right, an immaterial soul informing a living biological organism. And I think everything we do going forward is going to rely upon this in one way or another, right? So, that kind of Lockean conception is incredibly prevalent today in these bioethical debates. We're going to see this time and time again, where, if you look at like a PBS patient, for instance, people argue that the person no longer exists, right? Someone with advanced dementia, the person no longer exists. Their body may continue to exist, or in the abortion debate, they'll argue that your body may exist, but you don't exist yet until the 12th week or the 15th week or the 18th week, or something like that. And that's when you come into existence, right? But that's going to be essentially a kind of Cartesian body-self dualism, right? The idea that your body could exist, but you do not exist, right? Does that make sense? Right. So I find this amazing that so many of these people, someone like Michael Tooley, who's a very, he's a avowed, physicalist, right? He claims to be this hardcore physicalist, materialist. When it really comes down to it, is a kind of Cartesian Gnostic, right? Right. And I've pushed this point in my scholarship. I'll continue to push it. I find this to be a very, very effective line of argument. It makes them very, very nervous. The new natural law people, to their credit, I think they do utilize this argument in a very effective way. Robert George and Patrick Lee have a very good book on this called Body-Self Dualism that was published by Cambridge Press. Grisey was really the first person to really note this, I would say. He gave the presidential address to the American Catholic Philosophical Association in 1989. The article is called When Do Human Beings Begin, or When Do People Begin? And he really develops this line of argument in a powerful way.
May I ask a question about
Sure.
that?
Sure.
I'm kind of confused. Is that to say, for example, that the body of the human being may begin at conception, but we don't know when the soul enters? So if the soul perhaps doesn't enter until birth, then that's not a full person until birth.
Well, that would be the view.
And we don't know.
Well, I would say Eberl and I would defend, and St. Thomas, I would say that substantial change takes place at conception, right? When the fertilization process has completed, we have substantial change. We have a human person at that point, right? So at that point, we have the rational soul informing a material body, right? And after that, it's simply a matter of growth and development, right? The other account's going to have to say that you're actually going to undergo 4 or 5 different substantial changes, right? So when you go from a zygote to an embryo to a fetus to an infant, right? Those are substantial changes, right? Those are distinct substances. And those are distinct kinds of things. I would say, in fact, those are sortal terms. Anybody know what a sortal term is from logic? Sortal term refers to a stage of existence. So I would say those terms zygote, embryo, fetus.
Did you spell that? Sort?
Yes, sortal, S-O-R-T-A-L. So I would say those terms refer to different temporal stages of existence, but they do not refer to distinct kinds of things, right? Other terms would be teenager, senior citizen, elderly, right? We wouldn't say that, teenagers, as difficult as they are, we wouldn't say that they're not human beings, that there's some kind of distinct kind of thing, or the elderly, right? Likewise, we wouldn't say that a zygote or an embryo or a fetus or an infant or a toddler is a distinct kind of thing, right? Those aren't just substantial changes. There's one substantial change that takes place, I would say, at conception, when, within the Catholic tradition, with the Thomistic tradition, right, where the parents are the natural secondary causes, and then God is the primary cause. God is creating an immortal soul in that act of conception as well, right? So you have the rational soul then at that moment begins to inform, right, the biological organism, right? At that moment you have creation of a human person. And after that, everything is just simply a matter of accidental growth and development.
So the soul participates in creating the material?
In informing the material, right? So we have a very particular type of soul, right? St. Thomas said we have a rational soul, right, which is distinct from a sensible soul or a vegetative soul, right? So we have unique capacities, we have unique powers that no other being possesses, right? And those will be manifested as long as, we're not killed, as long as we have proper environment, right? We have proper, healthy environment in our mother's womb, and we're raised properly, proper nutrition and care. Those rational those operations will become manifest, right? So
does that include then a conversation about what is consciousness, and when does that is that integral to a human being from the beginning?
Okay, good. Yeah, so the Lockean account or the Cartesian Gnostic account will say, yes, they'll identify personhood with psychological continuity over time. And if you lose that psychological continuity over time, then you cease to exist as a person. So let's say, Peter Singer's mother developed very advanced dementia, and she lost her sense of self, identity. And, Singer has argued that these people are no longer persons. And so they can be killed, right? They no longer should be legally protected. It's very interesting in his own life, though, he refused to have his mother killed, right? He didn't have the kind of courage of his own convictions there, right? They will argue that, children will not become persons until somewhere between the ages of 3 and 5. They will defend infanticide, up to that point, until a child is capable of complex problem solving, psychological continuity over time, more advanced rational operations. They will argue that you are not a person, you are a human being, but only persons have moral status and should be, legally protected. So some people will say, well, they've given a reductio of their own position at that point, right? I mean, if you're defending infanticide, I mean, you've kind of, you've given a reductio argument at that point. Bill, do you want to make a point?
I wanted to ask for a brief comparison of non-human persons then, like what do they mean by the persons of the Trinity or angels persons?
Yes. So yes, St. Thomas will say yes, right? Absolutely. It's interesting that term person first arises in Trinitarian theology, right? I mean, that term, so it comes from the Greek persona as a translation, the Greek prosopon, right? Which initially referred to the masks that were worn in Greek tragedy by the actors on stage. So yeah, I mean, this term, which has become so prevalent, has these deep roots in Christian Trinitarian theology, right? So yes, I mean, Aquinas will argue that, obviously the persons of the Trinity are divine persons. You argue angels are persons as well. And we are a very unique type of person insofar as our cognition requires and depends upon having a body and having sensible faculties, right? So we need our senses, right? Aristotle and Aquinas are going to famously argue that there's nothing in the intellect that is not first passed through the senses, right? So we need our senses to acquire those sensible phantasms and then to abstract from them the intelligible species, right? That we can then reflect upon. This raises then questions about the intermediate state between death and bodily resurrection, what's going on during that time, right? Eberl gives an interesting account of this and different possibilities. He's relying on Eleanor Stump, who I highly recommend. Eleanor Stump is a professor at St. Louis University. I think she's one of the top Thomistic scholars in the world. But Stump will argue there that, and Aquinas will argue as well, that we will have a kind of intellective memory, and in the intermediate state, we can reflect upon memories that we have and those intelligible essences that we have acquired while we were alive. There may also, another possibility would be a kind of divine illumination where God is giving us new objects of thought during that period of the intermediate state. Another possibility is that it may be something analogous to a kind of PBS state where we're not conscious during the intermediate state, and then we become conscious again with bodily resurrection. So I think those are 3 different possibilities, but those are very complex, very difficult, very interesting topics. Obviously theological topics, but bioethics forces you to engage with these topics. Other thoughts here? I would say if you're engaging with somebody like a Peter Singer, Marianne Warren, Michael Tooley, Judith Jarvis Thompson, somebody who is coming from more secular background, who doesn't share, your theological commitments, that approach is not going to be very effective. And so, if you walk into Harvard Medical School and, you argue against, something because of the Mosaic Law or some prohibition in the Mosaic Law or in the book of Leviticus, it's not going to be very effective rhetorically. And so I would say we're going to have to look to somebody like St. Thomas. I think St. Thomas gives us a really powerful, comprehensive, integrated, compelling metaphysical and ethical framework to deal with these issues. And that's what I want to focus on going forward. So, John, do you want to wrap it up here tonight, or do you want to keep going a little bit, or what do you think?
No, let's see, what time is it? Yeah, I think we can wrap it up. I think, there's a lot of discussion here. This is probably the most interactive course session we've had in the fellowship, which is a very, very good thing. I think we're also limited on time, and your time is extremely valuable to us. So what I might encourage, I know me, when I asked my question, I had like 10 follow-ups in mind.
Right.
And I say, okay, that's enough for me. A lot of discussion would be really well placed on the website, on the back end of the virtual campus. And these are like great. I think everything we talk about here is great, that could be continued all week, back and forth on the campus chat feature back there. So please use that as much as you can. And Dr. Furlan, you'll be around to jump in on there as well, I'd imagine.
Yeah.
So that's I guess just what I would say as far as housekeeping goes. But this has been amazing, and I wish we had more than 4 weeks. So we'll try to get all we can out of this here. So
yeah.
thank
you. Feel like drinking from a fire hose at times, but the focus is on building a foundation. And as Aristotle says, a good beginning is more than half the whole. And I just taught a semester-long doctoral course on this, and it could easily have been a year-long course. So we're just trying to lay down some foundations and some basic fundamental principles. For tonight, I would just really focus on this definition of just what it is to be human here at the end, right? So that we are a substance of a rational nature, right? That we are, hylomorphic unity of a rational soul informing a body, a living biological. We are, so I'd say we don't have bodies, we are bodies. That's a really important point. Our bodies are not extrinsic to us. Our body is not something that we can cast off, right? Socrates will use that image in the Platonic dialogues of his body being a kind of cloak that you can cast off, or a pilot navigating a ship, right? Aristotle and Aquinas will strongly push back against that and argue that we are bodies, right? We are animals, we are living biological organisms, but we are a very unique type of living biological organism, right? We have unique rational capacities that no other being possesses. You look at book 3 of the De Anima, Aristotle he's in awe of what he's describing. He says there's something divine, there's something godlike about the human elect, right? So we're going to continue to explore that as we move forward. But think about that and how that differs from that Cartesian Platonic kind of Gnostic account that you are a ghost or a spirit inhabiting, possessing a body, right? But your body is something extrinsic to you that you can discard or cast off. Okay, I think that's a good place to finish for tonight.
Excellent. Everybody, thank you so much, and we will see you next week.
Okay, thank you, everybody. Okay, good night.